There were claims of Russians in the 70s doing some theoretical physics connected to unified field theory and consciousness and relating to torsion. And as far as I can tell, it seems like it's not a good PR move during the Cold War to claim that Russia's figured out a unified field theory.
Right.
So I don't know the validity of those theories either. And probably a lot of those theories were wrong. But I just noticed that there were theories that were published in the West that were very similar or sometimes identical that didn't cite the Russians. And there was also a response in the West to say that those theories were crazy as well. And there's been evidence in the past decades suggesting that a lot of these theories from the 70s aren't as crazy as it seemed. Once again, it goes back to kind of no-go theorems. People said, oh, if you add any types of terms like this, it's going to lead to bad effects that are unphysical because of some math theorem that I put together and I cooked up. And so there was a lot of evidence suggesting that a lot of these exotic theories that that geometry that Eric Weinstein's talking about, torsion, space-time torsion, that stuff, there's this notion of propagating torsion. And the Russians were studying this during the Cold War. And whatever reason, it was a very active area of research in the West from, the 50s to 70s. And eventually, it's very bizarre what happened. This torsion is in string theory. But what they do is they end up saying, at the end of the day, they make this statement, in vacuum, the torsion vanishes. And I'm joking, like they almost put it in capital letters. Like, there is no torsion in the vacuum. And so they send out this message saying, oh, we don't have the crazy torsion, but it's actually in their math. The string theorists are doing all the rigorous math. It just to study the electron in curved spacetime, you need torsion to minimally couple it to get a good theory that makes sense based on the principles that we currently use. It requires this torsion. Maybe it's not propagating. Maybe it's not a literal wave equation. Maybe it's just inside matter itself. But it seems to be relevant. And what has happened is they say, okay, well, what's the experimental implications? And they say gravity is about looking into the stars. And so they'll run these tests. They'll say, what is the chances of there being torsion? They'll add in all these terms into their theories, put coefficients, and try to see, should the coefficients be zero? Because if the coefficients are zero, then the whole thing cancels out and it's like not real. And so what they find, they look into the stars and they say, this torsion, it shouldn't affect any of the motion of the stars. From the experimental data, it doesn't look like torsion exists, so it's not real. It's not physical. But they're looking in the wrong place because there's work showing how it's actually an internal gravitational symmetry, whereas we currently think that gravity is only an external symmetry. And so that relates to why it's relevant for the stars, things out there. But it turns out this torsion is more relevant for elementary particles, for atoms, inside matter. If you're trying to make a UFO, you're trying to figure out, how do I use materials from the real world and get this space-time curvature? And how do you engineer it to get the desired space-time warping so I can just, rather than moving through space-time, I bend space-time and then just come along for the ride. And so everyone experimentally is looking for torsion in the wrong places. And the nice theories already predict that it's very difficult to experimentally detect this stuff, but it provides theoretical self-consistency in the theories and probably is actually helpful for quantum gravity. But there's this Wikipedia page, I think it's torsion fields, and it says pseudoscience in parentheses.
Really?
So there's a torsion wiki page, and then there's a torsion field pseudoscience page. And it's a very strange thing because they'll say, or sometimes called the axion field, which is studied in string theory. And it's like, wait, so are you saying torsion is crackpot Wikipedia? Is that what you're... I mean, it makes no sense.
Torsion field, oh my God. The fucking title of it is pseudoscience.
So this is what's happening, where basically anyone in academia who doesn't have the time to look into torsion, right? They just heard from someone else. They heard through the grapevine that torsion's crazy, right? Some Russians studied it, and they don't even show like the original dates. They claim that the Russians looked in the 1990s after the Cold War. It's like, no, they were looking at it before that. So yeah, there's a lot of bold claims. There was this Russian who maybe even in the 50s or 60s, he claimed to detect torsion from the sky and claimed that it moved faster than light. There's a lack of consensus on that. No one seems to agree with that claim. Maybe it's wrong. Maybe this guy Kozyrev, I don't even know if he's mentioned on that page, which shows you that they're kind of withholding it. Maybe he's on there, but basically there's something going on here for quantum gravity, and depending on, there's different theories that you can have with space-time torsion, and some of them have what could be anti-gravity. But just because you can write down a theory that has anti-gravity doesn't mean it describes nature. So that's the challenge. We're trying to figure out what is the good theory. And the problem is a lot of these theories, some of them, a good class of them, they don't predict enough differences from the standard theory for us to tell. But we know that we're starting to study condensed matter systems, which are just like complicated phases of matter in the laboratory. And it hasn't really gotten to the gravitational point yet, but we're starting to understand that there's a lot of exotic phases of matter, nothing to do with gravity. We can make exotic materials or metamaterials, and those maybe there's some way we can optically pump these materials at different frequencies to create resonant states that effectively lead to new quasi-particles. So we're getting better at becoming alchemists of reality to create arbitrary materials. And so once we start doing that, one of the things I've been trying to point out is that once we connect it to gravity, we should be thinking about things like torsion and non-metricity, which is even more exotic. Fortunately, it's so exotic that there's not as much of a taboo, but it is very strange. The properties it has are very difficult to wrap your head around mathematically and physically, so people prefer not to study it. But when you look into the unified field theory, it seems like getting the exotic matter in there, we should at least stay open-minded and say, there's this mathematics, maybe it'll have utility in the future. And so rather than just blindly rejecting all this mathematics, I'm trying to advocate that we at least study it and stay open-minded. We don't know exactly what theory, but maybe someday there's something in a lab that gets measured that we can't describe, and maybe that's when it turns out, oh, we finally found something in the lab that is giving us something that we can't predict. Maybe that's something going on gravitationally. And we know that there's actually, even in chemistry, there's always slight experimental errors in the measurements. And it ultimately relates to quantum mechanics, and it relates to spin. And as I was mentioning, spin is supposed to source torsion, it seems, because it's torquing space-time. So you have matter that's spinning, and it's like torquing space-time with it. And so if we're neglecting that, there's actually someone who worked at Caltech. She didn't mention torsion, but she said that quantum gravity might describe some of these discrepancies in chemistry, which is a little counterintuitive because you'd expect gravity to do with planets. If we can't feel the gravitational forces between you and I, why would something even smaller affect gravity? But it's not because of the mass or the energy, it's the spin. And the spin of an electron, and it's also a spin density. That's the other important. It's the spin divided by the volume. So that's actually what sources torsion.
Right.
And so if you have something that's really small and it's spinning like a particle, then that might actually lead to torsion. So there's actually no reason to expect that a star that's so huge would lead to torsion, because it's so big that it's going to have a small spin density.
Right.
So it could turn out that as we start exploring these more exotic metamaterials and try to figure out if we can build anti-gravity craft, maybe some of that gravitational physics will come into play.